this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on will, concerning mostly distinctions in terms of responsible conducts and or irresponsible conducts, as we're more interested in most cases, explaining guilt and or innocence when it comes to criminality. Without certain concepts of will, it would be incredibly difficult to explain the guilty mind and or the guilty act, whom is responsible for, from one's direct perception causations, engaging in criminality. Without will, had one no will to conduct one's mind in relation to certain innervations within the nervous system to engage misconducts, one truly could not be held responsible for engaging in criminality, as there would be nothing to connect the self to distinct innervations within the nervous system. And therefore, the criminal justice system would be, in many ways, unjust, as it would be beyond an individual's control to engage and or even prevent criminality. And it's often within the treatments that we are most concerned with, treating defects within an individual's will. Often attempting to engage in certain treatments to influence the subjectivity of the criminal to desist and take responsibility for one's own misconducts, to be held responsible and or to then subsequently calibrate the mind to certain future-oriented pathways to desist within what's appropriate and or calibrated towards more meaningful, productive contributions to society, instead of engaging in what's more likely to result in often deprivations of underlying psychological needs that are what tends to motivate most crime and or what constitutes the disease of criminality, as many offenders tend to suffer from chronic diseases and or including certain psychiatric illnesses, including depression and or anxiety, with a subset of those individuals whom, even within the cases they may be being tried for guilt prior to sentencing, may not be found to be fit enough to stand trial. And this means that they are typically found to have some sort of what's called in court and what's distinct in terms of its name within mental diagnostics in law is the disease of mind, associated with certain unique pathologies within the guilty mind that prevent an individual from appreciating and or being competent enough to stand trial and or make sense of the essential evidence and or facts to appreciate the, as a must be, good enough and necessarily necessary conditions to proceed with the trial within what's lawful and or meets a rational expectation. As it's often within semi-structured interviews that are drawing from data proportionate to evaluate certain judgments, that there are rational individuals whom are judging what's appropriate to constitute the necessary treatments to allowance the individual to proceed with trial and or to altogether in some cases be hospitalized and or detained instead in a psychiatric ward to receive the appropriate treatment there instead of within the legal stream and going through the more difficult, strenuous process of future-oriented legal proceedings and or in some cases subsequently sentencing had the individual been found guilty. In many cases of more serious psychiatric illness resulting in what's named disease of mind, not psychiatric illness in the courts. There's distinctions between the treatment that psychologists and or psychiatrists are providing individuals who may receive therapy and or who may be detained within a psychiatric facility compared to individuals whom are competent enough to stand on trial and or provided the option yet may not always accept and or reject the recommended treatment of therapists and or psychiatrists, be it that in some cases it's more optional and or in some cases mandatory, and yet some individuals do not always receive treatment, often avoiding treatment and or in some cases commit crimes in relation to even receiving treatment, retaliating in certain cases. And you often see in more cases related to detainment within psychiatric psychiatric facilities, you have individuals who may have committed a crime and or may have been detained for being a risk to themselves and or others in society, to allowance for legal and or medical intervention, whom are more reactive and are often resisting the treatment that they may be receiving, engaging in more violent conducts and or often yelling and or screaming and or often will attack nurses, and nurses tend to be the most abused individuals by their, be it clients and or patients, compared to any other profession. Nurses experience the most violence within their work, and that tends to be a result of dealing with the most unstable individuals whom are often highly reactive and have dysfunctions in terms of their will to often, be it that they are engaging their will to engage certain misconducts, there are certain disruptions that prevent an individual from engaging more responsible duty of care within the conducts, not to exempt the individual whom is guilty and or responsible for certain injury upon injuring another and or future-oriented threat, as these individuals are still risks, and they're risks to others for often what is in their will to conduct within a distinct direction, yet there is often diminished responsibility that we attribute to individuals whom, be it more unjust to provided that they are suffering with a certain underlying chronic illness that may be unrelated to certain violations and yet is often influencing certain misconducts, diminish the guilt per se, not necessarily excusing and or justifying the misconduct, yet where guilt is reevaluated in terms of more proportionate judgments is within the treatment option, to mean that we do not hold individuals whom are suffering from certain chronic diseases and or illness more related to certain impairments within the guilty mind to provide more harsher treatments than compassionate treatments, not necessarily empathetic treatments, but compassionate treatments to alleviate the suffering that is arbitrary and or unnecessary, resulting from the unique issues that the individual is suffering from, to prevent future-oriented violence and or misconduct that is often related to a distinct combination of intracategorical and or intercategorical problems within the individual's existencia. It could be they have difficulty engaging certain meaningful relationships, and or perhaps they have no meaningful employable skills. And as a result, this leads to more experiential encounters with feelings of incompetence and or futility, that one is unable to, say, satisfy the essential underlying psychological needs as one should expect, and or sees others satisfying their needs and thinks to themselves in more of these woes of thought, having not undertaken the necessary conditions to satisfy the responsabilidade e o voluntary suffering in order to undergo the more difficult, cumbersome practice to train and or strengthen one's conducts to build the competence within certain domain-specific pursuits to increase one's employability from the abilities one may engage in terms of being able to conduct more conducts and engage creative problem solving and or conflict resolution skills, and or, say, speak different languages and or cook and or clean, being able to engage more conducts that allows for more employable opportunities from undertaking the difficulties to learn something new and or different, and or train the learns that one learns to cultivate the competence within the intercategorical and or intracategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies that allows for more employment opportunities, compared to perhaps staying at home and doing nothing, awaiting for one to perhaps be told to go to a job interview and or will be employed and or will receive training with little need to practice and or engage meaningful conducts within one's will to engage self-conducted learning that elaborates the complexities of one's being, with the livagência to creatively explore and or navigate the internal and or external world, elaborating the factável conducts uma poderá engajado distinto conduz, to expand the range of skills one can employ to allowance for a vaster arsenal of more meaningful resolutions to problems within brainstorming from existing priors, the meaningful similarities inferring distinct consequences with distinct positive and or negative consequents that allowance for meaningful predictions to resolve certain categorical problems from meaningful similarities had one undergone the responsible conducts to attempt to resolve problems within one's past that builds competence from engaging and or confronting stressors and or resolving those stressors proactively, building up one's competence. And it's often individuals who tend to have difficulty with regulating emotions and or appropriately resolving emotion-focused problems in relation to stressors that allowance for more meaningful solutions that individuals whom are experiencing dysfunctions tend to have deficits in terms of employing the appropriate proactive and or emotional focused coping skills compared to instead tend to engage in what's called problem-focused coping, ruminating over the issue and or cultivating resentments and or grievances within one's being, irresponsibly and or negligent, that results in more harms from the woes, thinking, woe is me, why am I experiencing this suffering? It seems so unjust. And yes, perhaps that it may seem unjust that you are experiencing what, had you undergone the appropriate duty of care to satisfy your needs within what was something you could have done and could have done meaningfully existing prior, yet foregone for the negligence in what would, within your choices, result in a subset of less optimal choices, future-oriented from the harmful choices you had made in your past, irresponsibly, that increase the likelihood of engaging in more misconducts resulting from feelings of futility and or resentment and or grievances. Criminality itself is a predictor of worse life outcomes, including a shorter life course and or deficits in terms of learning and memory, including creativity, and or also tends to be associated with hospitalizations in terms of often psychotic illness, resulting from often a history of engaging in not uniquely misconducts, yet more irresponsible thinking and irresponsible misconducts that result in those misconducts that originate within an individual's deliberations within one's will, that we are most concerned with in terms of the evaluation of the guilty mind, to often infer the guilty acts from what's going on within one's mind, inferring certain misconducts from the will those conducts result from certain direct perception causations, inferring that in the case that one premeditates a more serious crime, be it first-degree murder, requiring that there be a criteria satisfied associated with some premeditation of the murder, compared to manslaughter, that one may murder another individual with little preparation and or duty of care, and in some cases even negligence. So one may not have any desire to murder an individual, and yet lacking the intentionality to kill an individual from one's negligence that is foreseeable to result in serious injury and or death, engages in irresponsible misconducts resulting in another individual's death that may be charged and found guilty of manslaughter, yet may not be, and in some cases would be inappropriate to be found guilty of first-degree murder, as there is little to no premeditation. There's no desire to kill and or cultivating in one's will the planning of the appropriate murder weapon and or methods of causing serious injury and or taking someone's life. In the case of first-degree murder, the criteria does not always need one to desire murdering the individual, yet the serious injury and or foreseeable death of the individual is meaningful to constitute first degree and in some cases second degree murder, depending on the facts of the case and the evidence that support those facts. Compared to individuals whom we expect to be more meaningful contributors to society, whom the most meaningful contributors to society, who tend to advance human rights and or freedoms and or the tools and technologies you may consume on a day-to-day basis, often without even considering the origins and or the meaningfulness of the origination of the technology, originating in one's willful planning and or deliberations, engaging what needs to satisfy more necessary conditions to constitute certain responsible, step-by-step, exacting conducts within one's planning, always engaging the executive functioning of the brain, which is responsible for future-oriented planning and evaluation of distinct risks and or benefits meaningful to conduct willful conducts from the volitions one wills into the direction of desired meaningful effect, to allowance for often desired optimizing outcomes. So we tend to, within engaging more responsible conducts, prefer to maximize the positive consequence to allowance for the most positive consequences, compared to the negative consequence that we prefer to avoid the negative consequences. And consequents do not mean here that they are harmful per se, as positive consequence are the conducts that result in certain positive outcomes, be it that the outcomes here means positive consequences if it's a positive outcome, and or negative consequences if it's a negative outcome. And the negative consequence are what we infer that will result in certain causations that are more harmful and we would like to avoid. So engaging in more positive consequence are the conducts that are more likely to engage in certain causations that allowance for the optimizing of future-oriented benefits associated with the positive outcomes that we often most desire. And engaging more responsible conducts and or thinking within one's deliberations, judging what's more meaningful within the consequence and or the consequences associated with those consequences, allowance for meaningful navigations future-oriented within the world. From having certain variables that we can infer within the consequence to elaborate the complexities of what conducts will influence other certain events that allowance for one to more probabilistically experience the desired positive outcomes or avoid the negative outcomes, and the negative outcomes that tend to be more likely to be the resultants of certain negligent and or lack of the appropriate future-oriented evaluations, not having engaged the responsible future-oriented thinking to engage the complexities that's more, in some cases, difficult to evaluate within exploring unknown unknowns, where there might be missing information, and the gaps in meaningful information need to be explored to fill in meaningfully gaps in meaningful information, to allowance for the appropriate resolutions to problems from brainstorming what often has worked in the past, drawn from meaningful similarities that are expanded the more you engage responsible conducts and or creative problem solving that works. So you cultivate more meaningful solutions alongside the practical wisdom within your self-knowledge and or self-awareness. That allowance for meaningful navigations, future-oriented in the world as one strengthens one's will. That's all I want to say for this video. I hope you have an awesome week.